Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. This is Chapter 27, Organizational Problems of Industrial Unionism. After 40 years of intensive educational work by the progressive and militant elements in the trade union movement on the necessity for industrial unionism to organize the workers in the mass production industries of the country, at last it is being applied on a general scale by the Committee for Industrial Organization. The effectiveness of this type of unionism is being borne out in practice by the unparalleled growth of the CIO unions in steel, auto, rubber, oil, radio, shipbuilding, textile, transport, and other industries. Real strides are finally being made toward the organization of the great mass of workers in the basic industries. The growth of these industrial unions naturally is accompanied by a whole series of new problems, not only in regard to unionizing tactics and strike strategy, but also concerning organizational forms and the methods of conducting the union's activities generally. In the past, there have been few American trade unions formed on an industrial basis, notably the United Mine Workers of America, United Textile Workers, paper workers, brewery workers, and, at least on paper, butcher workmen, metal miners, and iron, steel, and tin workers, as well as the 4 semi-industrial needle trade unions. But the new CIO unions are coming into existence under conditions that raise many problems not previously solved by these forerunners of present-day industrial unionism. It is my purpose here to answer the most urgent of these questions, on the basis of broad experience, by many unions in the United States and other countries. In considering the organizing problems of the new industrial unions, it is necessary always to bear in mind the decisive fact that labor unions are organs of struggle. Unions sign trade agreements with the bosses and carry them out loyally. But behind these agreements, a relationship of power always exists. Thus, labor unions are able to secure concessions from the employers in direct ratio to their strength. Hence, all organization forms and practices in the industrial unions must be developed with regard to increasing the fighting power of these bodies. The basic improvement of the CIO industrial unions over the AF-of-L craft organizations is that they are more effective organs of struggle against capitalist exploitation. First, instead of splitting the workers of an industry, as the AF-of-L does, into from 10 to 25 separate craft unions, all of which are autonomous, pulling this way and that, and, consequently, quite incapable of bringing a solid pressure to bear against the employers, the CIO unites all the workers of a given industry into one broad industrial union, thereby enormously increasing the workers' strength. Second, instead of being dominated by arbitrary bureaucracies, such as rule practically every AF-of-L craft union and thereby paralyze the effectiveness of those organizations, the new industrial unions of the CIO, despite some undemocratic hangovers from the past, are developing a new trade union democracy, a real improvement which greatly increases their potentialities in the struggle against the employers. Behind the basic organizational differences between the AF-of-L and CIO unions stand 2 fundamentally divergent conceptions of unionism. On the one hand, the AF-of-L craft unionism characteristically does not consider or organize the workers as a class or recognize the existence of the class struggle. Instead, it caters principally to the more skilled elements, and it does not hesitate to sacrifice the welfare of the broad masses of the semi-skilled and unskilled in order to further the interests of the skilled workers. Upon this general outlook is based the whole policy of the AF-of-L, its wheedling attitude toward the employers, its subservient policy of class collaboration, its failure to organize the unorganized, its craft scabbery during the strikes, its tailing after the capitalist political parties and begging them for minor concessions, etc. We see the general results of such a narrow craft policy in the AF-of-L's repeated loss of strikes, its inability to organize the mass production industries, the insignificant percentage of workers, even of the skilled, that it has organized, and the weak position politically of the workers in American life. On the other hand, the CIO organizes the workers primarily as a class. Although the CIO leadership does not accept the class struggle in theory, the CIO's very birth, its broad unions, and its strong organizing campaigns and strikes testify eloquently enough to the reality of the class struggle. The basis of the CIO's industrial unionism is a militant defense of the interests not only of the privileged few skilled workers, but of the great masses of unskilled and semi-skilled as well. With this broader conception and policy of unionism, therefore, it is not to be wondered at that the rise of the CIO unions has been marked by the winning of many strikes against the great trusts, a tremendous strengthening of the trade union movement in the mass production industries, and the beginning of a broad political movement of the toilers that is heading in the direction of a farmer labor party. The AFL stands for craft unionism, the CIO for industrial unionism. The growth of the CIO implies the consolidation of the American proletariat for the first time as a class. It is a well-known fact that the political content of an organization's program expresses itself also in the whole structure and organizational practices of the body. In accordance with this principle, the AFL, during its half-century of existence, has built up a whole series of organizational forms and methods corresponding to and flowing out of its basic policy of craft unionism. It is fundamentally necessary that the new CIO industrial unions also adapt all their organic structures and methods of conducting business to fit in with their class conception of unionism. A firm discipline is a basic essential for the success of industrial unionism, as of labor unionism in general. Good organization and discipline give the workers greater confidence in themselves and in each other and hence increase their fighting capacity. Well-drilled soldiers are far better fighters than loosely organized, poorly trained recruits, and the same principle applies to labor unions. The industrial unions will do well, therefore, in the shaping of their activities, to keep in mind the necessity for creating a good discipline among their membership. With ruthless American capitalism to fight, such a discipline will stand them in good stead and, indeed, is a life and death question for them. Discipline, democracy, and education. To build up this necessary discipline, the prime essential is that the industrial unions conduct their affairs in a democratic manner. Trade unionists are not enlisted men, and they cannot be disciplined by mere arbitrary command of their leaders. Their discipline must be essentially self-imposed, and such voluntary union discipline can exist in maximum degree only if the workers feel that they are controlling the union's activities by democratic action. The AFL craft union leaders have always grossly violated the principles of trade union democracy. The result is that nearly all AFL unions are dominated by bureaucrats and dictators who, to enforce their arbitrary will and conservative policies upon the membership, have not hesitated often to use sluggers, stealing of elections, packing of conventions, and other ruthless methods of coercing the rank and file. This violation of democracy has also given birth to racketeering in the unions and has lowered the tone and effectiveness of the whole labor movement. To the extent that the industrial unions break with the traditional undemocratic methods of craft union leaders and develop a truly democratic life in their organizations, to that degree they will build up a better mass discipline and achieve the added strength that goes with it. But, of course, in establishing trade union democracy, it is not necessary to fly to the other extreme and turn the unions into mere debating societies. The correct policy is, first, a thorough discussion of the problem in hand and, then, a firm enforcement of the decision arrived at. Such a procedure at once guarantees a mass participation in policymaking and a good discipline in applying the policy decided upon. The organization principles contained in this whole pamphlet are based on this general conception of democratic centralism, which dovetails with the best trade union practices in all countries. A good labor discipline necessitates, as we have seen, a thoroughgoing trade union democracy, and such a democracy, in turn, requires an educated rank and file. Discipline, democracy, and education go hand in hand in the building of effective labor unionism, and the new, expanding industrial unions should write this elementary truth plainly in all their constitutions and ways of doing business. The AFL unions, with few exceptions, have flagrantly neglected the education of their members to the true nature of the capitalist system and the daily problems confronting them as workers. The philosophy of the dominant craft leaders is an open endorsement of capitalism, and their conceptions of many of the workers' problems are only the basic ideas of the employers covered over with a thin veneer of trade union phrases. Most of the craft unions have no organized educational departments whatever, and the educational value of their official journals is just about zero. The industrial unions should, of course, set up quite a different situation. They must begin earnestly the education of their members, and also of the broad masses generally. The CIO needle trades unions have done much valuable work in this vital field, but even this is only a start. Every stage of the labor movement, from the local union to the National Labor Federation, should have a well-organized, actively functioning educational department, working on a mass scale. In this manner, real progress can be made in offsetting the paralyzing effects of the vast stream of propaganda poison that the capitalists are pouring into the workers' minds through press, pulpit, radio, movies, etc., etc. The industrial unions will reap rich dividends from such educational work in the shape of better working and living conditions for their members and a bigger and stronger organization in every respect. The most important single educational task confronting the industrial unions is to build up a broad and effective labor press. One of the most disastrous weaknesses of the AFL unions has always been their miserable papers and magazines. The journals of the international unions are, with few exceptions, dry, uninteresting, saturated with insidious employer propaganda, and closed to progressive thought. The local trade union papers, both official and unofficial, are even worse. Many of them are simply parasitic blackmail sheets, corrupt and rotten to the core. Often they shamelessly take money from employers to fight everything progressive in the labor movement. They sell their columns and labor's endorsement to any political faker who wants them. Every important city has one or more such contemptible rags. And the low tone for all this degraded system of labor journalism is set by the American Federationist, national organ of the AFL. The columns of this magazine are packed with reactionary propaganda, advertisements of union-smashing open-shop companies, red-baiting, misrepresentations of industrial unionism, lying attacks upon the Soviet Union, etc. One of the great tasks of the CIO industrial union movement is to free American labor from the tentacles of this disgraceful craft union press, and to develop a progressive system of journalism worthy of the labor movement. The new labor press should reflect the great upsurge now developing among the masses. It should make a serious analysis of decaying capitalist society and teach the workers the way to free themselves from it. It should be a press wide open to the expression of socialism and communism. Each national industrial union should have a first-class weekly or monthly journal that goes to every member. Each city central council needs a clean, progressive weekly organ. The National Federation ought to publish a great labor daily paper. With such a powerful and progressive press, organized labor would make real progress in the struggle against the employers and their tremendous propaganda machine. AFL practices. Among the many harmful practices of AFL unions is the exclusion of large categories of workers from union membership for reasons of their sex, race, politics, etc. Thus, various unions specifically bar women from joining. Many more, either openly or covertly, refuse to organize Negroes. Still others do not take in young workers, and a whole raft of unions, including the National AFL itself, have clauses in their constitutions which prohibit the membership of communists. These narrow practices are nothing more or less than a reflection of the employer's policy of playing off one group of workers against another, and thus weakening them all. They have absolutely no place in the labor movement. They violate the most fundamental principle of unionism, the solidarity of all the workers, and they have done incalculable harm to the unions. They must not be allowed to continue on over into the industrial unions. On the contrary, the new union should throw these contemptible and harmful prejudices into the ashcan of history. The industrial unions should open their doors wide to all workers, except, of course, those barred for spying, scabbing, and other dishonorable actions, regardless of their sex, color, race, nationality, age, religion, or political opinion. The new unions should extend a warm hand of greeting to the doubly oppressed Negro workers. They should adopt a more liberal apprenticeship and trade school policy for the youth. They should be the special champions of women and their demands. And above all, they should be alert not to allow themselves or their officials to sink into the practice of red baiting, which is the weapon of all fascists and near-fascists, to attack everything that is progressive and effective in the labor movement. The industrial unions should also take a more intelligent attitude towards unemployed members than the craft unions do. During the depths of the great industrial crisis of the past several years, the AFL unions brutally expelled hundreds of thousands of unemployed members. Then they went further along this wrong road by callously neglecting the demands of the starving unemployed and trailing after the infamous Hoover Share the Work scheme. Contrary to all this wrong course, the industrial unions should base their policy upon the unity of interests and organizations of the employed and unemployed. This means that they should retain the unemployed in the unions and fight for their demands. In the next industrial crisis, which already even the capitalist economists recognize to be not so far ahead, the employed and the vast armies of unemployed must present a solid front. There are still some 8 million workers unemployed, and the unions should give active support to their demands and also to the Workers' Alliance, the organization of WPA and unemployed workers. One of the main reasons why the AFL unions have remained so unprogressive, clinging stubbornly to their horse and buggy craft system of unionism in an era of mass production, in which this type of organization is hopelessly obsolete, is because they have become heavily encrusted with a conservative bureaucratic leadership that is unresponsive to the needs and interests of the rank and file. To keep themselves in power and to fatten off the unions, these leaders employ a whole series of undemocratic, unproletarian methods that the industrial unions must avoid on pain of a similar stagnation as that which now afflicts the craft unions. Among these harmful practices of corrupt craft officials are having themselves, by hook or crook, elected to office for life, paying themselves enormous salaries and expenses, handling the union funds as though they were their own personal property, assuming arbitrary power over the membership in various ways, building up executive boards which perpetuate themselves by filling all vacancies through appointment, and by various other democracy-destroying devices that would bring a blush to the face of the Tammany Hall boss. The health and progress of labor unions demand that their officers be the members' servants, not their masters. Democracy in AFL craft union conventions is more honored in the breach than in the observance. Reactionary union officials have developed a whole series of corrupt devices to maintain their own control and to prevent the will of the membership from prevailing. This is one of the principal causes for the weakness and unprogressiveness of craft unions. Of these crooked schemes, the following are among the most notorious and harmful. A. Narrowing down the convention delegations largely to paid officials. B. Packing the conventions with delegates from blue sky locals. C. Making the conventions so expensive by high per diem rates that they cannot be held often. D. Arbitrarily suppressing the conventions altogether. The retail clerks have not held a convention for 15 years, or by having excessively long intervals between them, 8 years between the last 2 conventions of the Carpenters Union. E. Appointment of all convention committees by the union's president. F. Stalling the conventions along and then rushing the important business through in the last hours. G. The practice of 1,000 parliamentary tricks to kill discussion and to thwart progressive legislation, etc., etc. To help ensure democratic representative conventions, the industrial unions should adopt, among others, the following measures. A. National conventions should be held at intervals not to exceed 2 years. B. Have broad rank-and-file delegations in the convention. C. Publication of the convention agenda and officers' report at least 30 days before the convention date so that they may be discussed by the membership. D. strict financial reports as the basis of local union representation, such reports to be available to the convention delegates. E. All convention committees to be voted on and amended if so desired by the convention delegates. F. No restrictions upon the introduction of resolutions by local unions before or during the conventions. G. Strict prohibition of all direct and indirect proxy delegates and voting. H. The right of a 30% minority of delegates to secure a roll call vote. I. The holding of the conventions in important centers of the industry instead of in remote places where delegates find it difficult to attend. J. Convention expenses of delegates to be split 50-50 between the local unions and the national organization. K. A reasonable per diem of expense for delegates and thus avoidance of petty corruption and great cost of conventions. L. Only local union delegates should vote. Officials, as such, should have no votes. M. No examination of the political opinions of delegates by convention committees as a condition for their seating. N. The convention to be adjourned only by majority vote to prevent officials from arbitrarily closing the convention to stifle democratic rule. The representation of local unions in the convention should be based upon a principle of modified proportional representation. This means that there should be a minimum of delegates allowed to all locals, plus a diminishing ratio of delegates as the locals increase in size. This system is the best protection against the dangers, on the one hand, of a few big locals dominating the convention, and, on the other, of domination being exercised by a lot of small, weak locals. This general system of representation should also be applied to central labor councils, state federations, and the National Labor Federation. When convention roll call votes are taken, however, the various delegates should be allowed votes on the basis of, for example, 1 vote to each 100 of their actual membership. Correct constitutional laws alone will not ensure a union's being democratic, for in the last analysis this depends upon the alertness and political development of the membership. But such laws are vital, nevertheless, as they place in the hands of the rank and file effective democratic weapons if they will but use them. An important democratic system that the industrial unions should develop is the initiative, referendum, and recall. This means that the membership retains the right at all times to initiate new policy, to vote on any proposals that may be before the union or its executive, and to recall any officer from his post by a majority vote. These effective democratic measures have never flourished in the narrow, conservative AFL unions, although a few unions, miners, machinists, needle trades, etc., have some traces of them. The referendum should work thus. The National Convention of the Union should have full power to act upon all questions. It should elect all general officers, make constitutional amendments, set assessments, decide upon strikes, and generally establish the union's policy. But a substantial minority of the delegates, not less than 30%, should have the right, if they so desire, to have any of the convention's decisions referred to a vote of the general membership. Certain basic matters, such as important strikes and strike settlements, questions of the union's national affiliation, heavy assessments, etc., should, as a matter of settled policy, be referred to the membership for a general vote. The National Executive Board of the Union, as well as the convention, should also be required to submit all major matters of policy to a national vote of the members, and a given percentage of the local unions should have the right to demand that any decision of the executive board be referred to a general vote. The initiative should operate to give the membership the right, especially between conventions, to initiate new policy. Thus, on the demand of a given number of locals, say 10% or so, the National Executive Board should stand instructed to consider any proposed policy and, if need be, to submit it to a general membership vote. The recall should be regulated in such a manner that the membership, in a given local union or nationally, should have the right to initiate a vote to recall from office at any time any official, national, district, local, or shop, without formal trial proceedings. Strikes, negotiations, and agreements. Strikes are the basic means of a labor union to improve the conditions of the workers. The effectiveness of any given union depends, in the last analysis, upon its ability to bring production to a standstill in its craft or industry, and thus to halt the employer's golden stream of profits. And precisely because of their great importance, strikes put the unions, their leaders, and their policies to the acid test. With the unions confronting the great power of the employers and the state, strikes should not be entered into lightly. Aside from questions of strategy, of seizing upon the right time to strike, and of making all essential technical preparations, the most fundamental necessity of a strike is that it have the full backing of the workers involved. This means that the workers must have the decisive say as to whether or not they shall enter into the struggle, with all its dangers and hardships. The power to declare strikes and to call them off must rest finally with the workers themselves. From every angle, this democratic control of strikes is necessary to the health of a union. One of the most prolific sources of general weakness and official corruption in the AFL unions is the usurped power of business agents and other officials to call strikes on or off without consulting the rank and file. Such arbitrary action is the road to defeat of the union, demoralization of the workers, and corruption of the officials. Before a strike is launched, a vote should be taken of the workers involved, and before any settlement is made, either during the strike or prior to its calling, the workers themselves must have the right to decide whether or not it is acceptable. Trade union democracy reaches its highest and most vital expression in the control of strikes, and to assure democracy in this fundamental matter, the industrial unions should make all necessary provisions. But to state that the workers must decide upon striking or not striking does not mean that every local union should have the right to embark indiscriminately upon strikes. Discipline and organized action must prevail or the union will be broken up. The best practice is that minor local strikes may be called by local unions and district councils, but that more important local strikes require the sanction of the National Executive Board, subject to the referendum procedure of the union. National strike action should only be determined upon after the matter has been passed favorably by a national convention of the union and endorsed by a general referendum vote. Strikes should not only be democratically called on and off, but also democratically managed. Broad strike committees, on a national, local, mill scale, with a heavy representation of rank-and-file strikers, are incomparably more effective and democratic than the narrow little cliques of officials that commonly run AFL strikes. Where there is more than one union in an industry, all should be represented on the Joint Strike Committee. Likewise, picketing and other strike activities should be carried on upon a democratic, i.e., mass basis. Direct negotiations are the most satisfactory methods for unions to deal with employers over the workers' demands. Arbitration should not be resorted to except where no other means are available, because employers, with their money and influence, have an uncanny record of winning over to their side the odd men on arbitration boards. Such people are usually middle-class liberal elements who, despite their fair-sounding words, in the pinch display employer sympathies. The workers, especially in AFL craft unions, have lost many a battle by a naive reliance upon slick-tongued arbiters. Employers are clever enough with their arbitration weapon. Usually their policy is to offer arbitration to strong unions and to refuse it to weak ones. Before accepting arbitration in a strike situation, the industrial unions should make sure of the following elementary considerations. A. Not to go into arbitration at all unless they are certain that they cannot, by a straight-out fight by the union, force the employers to make the needed concessions to the workers through direct negotiations. B. Compel the acceptance of the employers beforehand of as many of the union's proposals as they can, especially the question of union recognition, and thus limit as far as possible the number of demands to be arbitrated. C. Make a last-ditch fight to get the best possible composition of the arbitration board. D. Make it clear that an unsatisfactory award will not pacify the workers. The industrial unions should be on the alert to oppose all forms of compulsory and semi-compulsory arbitration. Craft union leaders, especially of the railroad unions, largely look upon arbitration as a sort of lifesaver, and they have openly cooperated with the employers to entangle the railroad unions with practically compulsory arbitration laws. Especially now does the danger of compulsory arbitration become very acute. Many employers, seeing the rapid progress of the CIO in organizing the mass production industries, believe that the halcyon days of the open shop are about over, and they think that the best way to cripple the unions would be to force compulsory arbitration and other forms of legal control upon them. This explains the appearance of many bills for state incorporation of unions, for limitation of picketing and the right to strike, etc., all of which tend in the general direction of state-controlled fascist unions. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. At all costs, the unions must defend their right to strike. Under no circumstances should they allow themselves to be hamstrung and paralyzed by anti-strike, compulsory arbitration laws, and similar practices. When the industrial unions sign agreements with the employers, they should live up to them. But, at the same time, they should be under no illusions as to the sacredness of such contracts, which AFL leaders are never done harping upon. The plain fact is that employers generally consider agreements with unions as mere matters of convenience. They sign them when they must and violate them when they think they can get away with it. They constantly chisel on wage, hour, and working conditions while an agreement is in force, and they do not hesitate to repudiate it altogether if they believe the situation is favorable for doing so. Thus, the Pennsylvania Railroad flagrantly violated the National Railroad Agreement of 1920 and was instrumental in provoking the nationwide shopman strike of 1922. The Pittsburgh Coal Company repudiated the UMWA Jacksonville Agreement and caused the National Bituminous Miners' Strike of 1927. Besides these cases, innumerable other instances of the employer's disregard for agreements with trade unions could be cited. The lesson from this is that trade unions must be alert at all times to enforce their agreements themselves. Within the framework of the agreement, they must constantly press for improved conditions. Here, a well-working shop steward system is vitally important. Any tendency of a union to rely upon the employer's fairness and honesty in living up to the terms of an agreement is bound to be disastrous to the workers' conditions and the stability of the union. The industrial unions, especially those in the mass production industries, should strive to secure general national agreements covering their whole industry. Unless this is done, the employers will play off one section of the workers against the others. Thus, for instance, where no national agreement exists, when the workers in a certain plant or company demand better conditions, they will be met by the very difficult argument that the employer is paying as much as his competitors. Thus, little can be wrung from him. And the same thing happens when it comes to his competitor's turn to meet the union committee. The craft unions have been up against this situation for years, with the employers playing off one craft or one section of the industry against the others, in order to keep the conditions of all as low as possible. The answer to this problem is national agreements covering whole industries. This means that the steel, auto, rubber, textile, and other industrial unions should definitely aim at such general agreements for their respective industries. In general, union-employer agreements should not run for long periods, especially not in times of rising prices like these. 2 years at most is long enough usually. The industrial unions should not go in for the long-term agreements, 5 to 10 years in some cases, that craft unions practice, to their own detriment. Agreements should also contain 30 or 60-day reopening clauses. In industries when several unions exist, whether CIO, AFL, or independent, every effort should be made to bring them all under joint agreements or at least under agreements expiring at the same time. Under no circumstances should one union stay at work while another in the same plant is striking, as we see being done daily by craft unions. Such union strike-breaking has broken hundreds of strikes and it must be stopped. Good union workers must not walk through picket lines. They should arrange their union's strategy so that they all move simultaneously in a given industry. In signing agreements with employers, the industrial unions should be aware of inserting clauses prescribing financial penalties on the union or its members for unauthorized strikes. Long experience teaches that such clauses exercise a reactionary effect on the life of a union. In handling the question of unauthorized strikes, The union's own disciplinary powers are amply sufficient, especially now when the Liberty League pack of ultra-reactionaries are trying to cripple the unions by making them legally responsible, that is, by binding them hand and foot with legal restrictions. The union should be on guard against the insertion of penalty clauses in their agreements, and especially the unions should not include in their agreement clauses discrimination against workers because of age, sex, race, or political opinion. Union recognition in agreements with employers may assume several forms. A. The collective bargaining right only for the union's own members, as in effect with some new CIO unions, is only of a preliminary character and should be strengthened, as it exposes the union to the rivalry of company unionism under various guises. B. The collective bargaining right for all the workers of a given company, craft, or industry is a livable form of recognition and force in many industries, and it is essentially the system under which the railroad craft union operate. C. The preferential union shop, under which union members are given preference in employment, is a more advanced and effective type of union recognition and has long been used in some industries. D. The checkoff, by which employers deduct union dues from the workers' pay, is confined mostly to coal mining, and it was developed there, after a long struggle by the UMWA, largely because mine operators had previously established the practice of making deduction from workers' pay for powder, tools, company store supplies, etc. E. The closed shop, under which only union members are employed, widely developed in building, printing, transport, etc., is the most favorable form of recognition for a union, and it is the type the industrial union should strive towards in formulating their agreement. But it must always be borne in mind that even the best form of union recognition by an employer is not of itself sufficient to maintain the union intact. Only sound union policies and good organization work generally can do that. Initiation fees should be moderate, ranging from $1 or even less during organizing campaigns, not to exceed $10 or $15 when the union is well established. The industrial unions should never fall into the bad practice of the craft unions of charging enormous initiation fees, sometimes as much as $1,000, in order to keep workers out of the unions. At all times, the union's books must be open to receive new members. Job trust policies are one of the reasons for the weakness of craft unionism. Union dues should also be moderate, not the excessive rates charged in skilled workers' craft unions, sometimes as much as $10 to $15 per month. On the other hand, the industrial unions should not be cheap dues organizations, for they must have ample funds to conduct their activities. In most cases, $1 dues per month is about right, with lower rates for the poorer paid workers. Care should also be exercised not to load up the membership with needless assessments. Transfers from local to local and union to union should be free and universal. This correct system should be introduced immediately among the more closely related unions, and then gradually extended to cover other unions. The industrial union should be aware of the infamous AFL craft union permit system, by which regular good-standing members of one local, especially in the building trades, are not allowed to transfer into another local of the same international, but must pay $1 or $2 a day for a permit to work within its jurisdiction. Much of the money raised by this reactionary tax finds its way into the pockets of corrupt business agents and union secretaries. The trade union movement should have one label to indicate that a given product is union-made. The craft unions, true to their spirit of particularism and individualism, have no less than 50 labels. There should be a universal union label, and it should be automatically given to all shops that have signed union agreements with their workers, and should be similarly withdrawn from an employer when any union of his workers declares him unfair. One of the stifling influences in many craft unions is the careless and dishonest way the organization's funds are often handled by their officials. Time and again, it has been exposed how such people help themselves to union dues, initiation fees, permit money, etc., to the tune of thousands of dollars. All such demoralizing looseness should be strictly guarded against in the industrial unions. The financial department should be highly developed and have business-like arrangements instituted nationally and locally to take proper care of union monies. Detailed financial reports, not vague general summaries, should be issued frequently by the national office, and standard monthly reports submitted to all local unions. The union's funds should be deposited in certain designated banks in the union's name, not in the name of some official who then draws the interest. Traveling auditors should periodically check up on the handling of funds by the local unions, instructing them in the use of a standard bookkeeping system, organizing their auditing committees, etc. All national and important local financial reports should be certified by reputable public accountants. All officials who handle funds, locally or nationally, should be adequately bonded by reliable bonding companies, and defaulting secretaries should be prosecuted. The union should operate nationally, and also as far as possible locally, on a budget basis, regularly allocating specified percentages of its income into certain designated funds. Thus, special funds should be built up for the union's journal, organization work, educational activities, strikes, sick or death benefits. Strike funds. Craft unions often depend primarily upon paying relatively large strike benefits for winning their strikes, but industrial unions, because of their larger size and their broader scope of strike action, do not and cannot rely so much on winning strikes by virtue of strong strike benefits, but instead by the paralyzing power of their strikes. Nevertheless, they have a very acute need for funds during strikes. Huge strikes of miners have sometimes lasted for 6 months to a year, and provisions for this financial need should be made by building up strong strike funds. Sick and death benefits. The industrial unions, in some cases at least, may find it practicable to realize the stabilizing effect that comes from small sick and death benefits, but they must not overload themselves with such fraternal features, as this can then hinder the growth of the unions. The new unions should be militant fighters for Social Security legislation and active supporters of proletarian fraternal organizations, such as the International Workers' Order. The local unions should pay approximately 50% of their dues to the national office of the union as per capita tax, and about the same proportion of their initiation fees. The remainder, after deductions for regular local expenses, they should be allowed to spend as they may wish. One of the progress-killing measures of craft union leaders is to forbid local unions to expend any funds except for such purposes as reactionary bureaucratic officials see fit to endorse. 1937. That is the end of Chapter 7 of American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Have a good day.